All right, good morning, everyone. I always say thanks for coming, as if you had a choice, which you did. But I'm sure you're keen to find out, what we're going to be talking about and how it might help you to think about your own work. And I think it's really interesting that we're talking about the words situating and contributing because they're really, really important aspects of any PhD or Masters by Research. They're kind of integral aspects, but often it's not until you think about it later that you realize what it is you're actually doing and where it is situated. So when I was writing my lecture yesterday, I was just thinking, okay, so what was I doing and what did I actually contribute? Because I kind of forgotten and I wasn't really sure, and it was actually quite an enjoyable process to think about my own work and what it is that I'm doing and how it might be contributing. Of course, it might not be, or it might be contributing badly, but it's contributing in some way. So I'm going to talk today about screenwriting practice research specifically, because this is my area and the area that a lot of my candidates are working in. I'm going to talk a little bit about quite a bit about my own PhD and how that kind of evolved, the challenges and opportunities that were presented with the PhD. I'm going to talk a bit about my work since the PhD and how I've kind of developed understandings of creative practice as a methodology, and more specifically for screenwriting practice research. As I'll talk about, it's still a nascent area. It's kind of situated within lots of different disciplines, and screenwriting practice as research is quite new. So it kind of involved a lot of kind of talking about this and getting people to understand what it is. So I'll talk a bit about that. And then through that, talking about the discourses that I and others have kind of created or generated in order to help other people situate their work, people who are working within screenwriting specifically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my current candidates and their screenwriting practice projects and how they're thinking about situating the work and how it kind of in a way links to my own PhD, but much further on. Okay, so where did it all begin? So it started with a desire for practice, and I use the word a desire for practice quite specifically, which I'll talk about in a second. And what I perceived were gaps in how screenwriting was being taught and written about. So at the time when I decided to do my PhD, or was encouraged or told to do my PhD, I was already teaching sessionally at a university. And so I was kind of exposed to a lot of the literature on screenwriting and screenwriting practice, and thinking about how people are teaching or writing about screenwriting. So a lot of my ideas came from where the gaps were in the kind of the teaching materials or the guides, if you like, on screenwriting. And so I knew that somehow I had to have a kind of a practice approach to that, my own work, but it started with just a desire for practice. I wasn't really sure how the practice would link with the theory, if you like. I was going to change the world, and obviously, as I say, I didn't. I was going to create this massive thing that was a series of chapters that could be a book, identifying the big gaps in screenwriting discourse. So things that people weren't talking about or writing about. So things like the minor character, openings and endings, emotional journeys of characters, and theoretical approaches to dialogue. So I had all these great ideas for all the gaps that I was going to fill and put them together as a PhD. And the screenplay would somehow demonstrate these things, but I wasn't really sure how, but I knew it kind of would. But of course, it was far too big, it wasn't focused, and it actually separated, in some ways, the theory from the practice. Because I wasn't thinking about how the screenplay would demonstrate or perform the research findings. So I had to recalibrate and rethink about what I was going to do and how I wasn't going to change the world. So I went back to practice. And so when I say at the beginning I had a desire for practice, what I meant was I knew it was going to be there somehow, going to fit in some way, but I wasn't really sure how. Whereas when I went back and refocused, I actually started with, okay, what is it about screenwriting practice that was missing from my own practice? What wasn't I doing? I was reflecting on some of the feedback I'd had from industry people about my work and what I wasn't achieving, and whether the PhD might help me do that. So what did I want to improve on? So I really went back to that kind of practice as a research approach. And within these questions around what was missing from my own work, I managed to find a theoretical or critical thread within this that I could explore. So the idea of emotional journeys came out. So as you can see from the initial list, just one aspect of what was this bigger initial project. So talking about, rather than being broad and shallow, being narrow and deep. So the whole PhD was going to be about exploring emotional journeys undertaken by characters in films. And my screenplay would contribute to that by exploring those issues on the page. So went back to practice, found a thread within my own practice and the things that people were saying about my work that wasn't working, that was bad, basically, and used the PhD as a way to kind of work through those things. And so all of that kind of helped me to really situate my work, as I'll talk about in a second, and kind of gauge how I might contribute. What is it I was going to contribute? Because at the top there you can see, because I was thinking about the screenwriting gaps from teaching and experiencing workshops with writers, that could almost be an education or a kind of a teaching-based PhD, which is very different. So I went back to this idea of practice and thinking, well, what is it I'm going to be contributing and to whom? So as I'll explore later, my whole outcomes from the PhD were contributing to screenwriting as research, to screenwriting practice, and broadly to kind of screen studies as well, actually, and creative writing. And there's quite a few different domains, which I'll talk about why. So even though it was kind of inspired by me teaching, it wasn't a teaching PhD, which it could have been. And so I was also thinking about how my work would contribute critically, i.e. the dissertation or the write-up of the work, but also creatively, i.e. the screenplay as knowledge. How would the screenplay embody the research findings? So it could be identified as like a research artifact. And at the time, I kind of knew that was going to be somehow the case, but I didn't really have a way of talking about it, articulating it, explaining it. Because as I'll explain in a second, creative writing, creative practice PhDs in the UK was still quite young at the time, especially compared to Australia. Screenwriting PhDs were pretty much non-existent. So I didn't have a language through which to talk about creative practice as a methodology and as research, which I can only really talk about passionately now, like, kind of 10 years later, or whatever it was. Okay. So as the PhD developed, and I should actually explain, not that it really matters, but I will, that I actually switched universities and supervisors midway through the PhD. Not that I'm suggesting you should think about that already, but there were a couple of reasons for this, and maybe this should be edited out. One was that where I was doing my PhD first, I had a very experienced screenwriting first supervisor who was really, really good, and he taught me at the master's level as well. My second supervisor was a literary theorist. She was a Sylvia Plath specialist. But also the university at the time, they got quite a lot of PhD students doing creative practice or creative writing specifically, but hadn't really got to grips with what does creative practice research mean. So I switched to a different university and a different supervisor who was basically publishing loads and loads of books and articles about creative writing research. So I really got from him this idea of what it actually means to do research through creative practice or creative writing. So just to give you that as an explainer, but I had to kind of draw from or situate myself within different bodies of literature to help me articulate my ideas, because like I said before, screenwriting as research was pretty much non-existent. Although there was some stuff going on in Australia, which I found out about later, in terms of PhDs and Masters by Research, people weren't writing about those experiences. They were just kind of held in repositories. So I actually find myself tapping into three key areas, really. And the first one was screen studies. And I've done a lot of this stuff in my undergraduate, so I knew some of the literature and some of the approaches. And so within screen studies, situating myself there, I was really looking at screen studies approaches to character, theme, narrative structure, and to some extent psychology, the psychology of character, how characters and audiences interact. And so I was looking at people like Joseph Campbell, Kristen Gorton, Luke Hockley, Murray Smith, and Carl Jung. Obviously, I like to keep good company, so there's some big names there. But as I'll explain later, screen studies was very much a studies approach, and I was getting lots of useful information, but it wasn't about practice. So I was also drawing from creative writing studies. really talking about creative practice research and methodologies. So Graham Harper, who's written loads of stuff, he was my supervisor in the end. A lot of his work, Nigel Crowth and Jerry Kroll, and all of these people are Australian. Graham was working in the UK, but he's actually an Australian. He got the first doctorate of creative arts, I think, from Australia. It's interesting to know. Nigel and Jerry written a lot about creative writing research, and still today you'll find most of the literature about creative practice research is from Australia, which I think is really interesting and good, and I think there's a lot more confidence here. But back in, say, 2005 when I started this thing, it was really young and people just didn't quite know what was going on. So I drew a lot from creative writing studies, and again, when I talk about this later, I'll talk about how that's influenced my current work as well. And I was also drawing, obviously, from screenwriting, but much more from the ideas of screenwriting practice, screenwriting discourse, and industry. At the time, there weren't really any books about screenwriting studies. There weren't anything about screenwriting practice research. It was all like looking at books around how to write screenplays or that kind of approach. So I was trying to pull them together and do something quite specific. So screenwriting was, and to some extent still is situated in a precarious place. Most of the creative writing PhD students that I knew at the time were doing novels. Some were doing poetry. Didn't talk to them much. No one I knew at the time was doing screenwriting. And in fact, I ended up having the first practice-based screenwriting PhD in the UK, which was probably 6 years later than the first one that was here in Australia, which just tells you something. So that was interesting. There was nothing really to draw from in terms of existing completed doctorates. Screenwriting studies, which is now a kind of discipline, didn't exist yet. In fact, it only really started to kind of become a big area after I'd finished the PhD. And like I said before, creative practice PhDs in the UK were still quite new. Maybe in art and design they'd been around a while, but in the kind of humanities and creative writing, they were still pretty new. And we had a lot of workshops where people would come in and talk about their PhDs that they were finishing or just finished. And they were almost like horror stories. They were talking about how the creative and critical work were separate. They were talking about how the examiners loved the creative work but hated the dissertation. It was all quite scary. There was this kind of like fear of what it was going to be. So it was in a way quite a challenging time, but I powered on through. So in the end, where did it situate the PhD? Because that's what we're talking about today. Well, it was actually a combination of screen studies and creative writing. So it was using a creative writing or a creative practice approach to both understand and operate within screen studies as a practitioner differently or better. So I was taking this is a creative writing approach to ideas that already exist here or ideas that in part exist. So I was saying basically this is kind of screen studies but using creative writing as a way of understanding that, which I think will be different today, as I'll talk about later. But that's the stuff I was drawing on, basically. And what was my contribution? Well, in the end, my contribution ended up being simply, he says, a new way of understanding how the emotional journey undertaken by a protagonist in a mainstream feature film is structured or plotted, and therefore can be practiced, i.e. the screenplay was based on this new model, which I'll talk about, and I obviously reflected on the process there. So it was pretty much, it sounds simple. It is simple, but it's just using existing ideas and just moving them on. It wasn't this world-changing, going to write this book that fills in the big gaps, da-da-da-da. It was just a simple moving on. So what I ended up doing, and I'll show you a little diagram in a second, was, you've all heard of the hero's journey. It's kind of a hokey, model which is used in various contexts. So Christopher Vogler, who you may know is this big Hollywood guru, he devised this model which has become like very well known and used internationally in all script writing scenarios. He based that on the work of Joseph Campbell. He kind of updated it for Hollywood screenwriting. So I ended up reinterpreting this by mapping what I call the physical journey and the emotional journey, which then, through my practice, played out via a comedy drama feature film. So I wrote this 95-minute feature film, which hasn't been made yet, by the way, about gay football teams, which was, quite funny. Well, not that funny because it would have been made. So basically I reinterpreted this hero's journey. This is what I discovered. That was my contribution. So just to give you a sense, this on the left, Joseph Campbell, this is his hero's journey. You may be familiar. These are the stages he kind of discovered through looking at thousands of stories, fairy tales, etc. Christopher Vogler's boiled down, some may say dumbed down, version is here on the right, the 12-stage model, which has been used widely in, everything from Disney right through to Darren Aronofsky. He's now a really famous consultant and has sold like hundreds of thousands of copies of his book. So basically what I ended up doing was this model here. So the 12 stages were kind of generic statements within each step. I ended up breaking each step down into physical and emotional beats or threads. So in each of these stages, this is the emotional journey, and this is the physical journey, and this is the relationship between the two. So I just basically took a model and moved it on. But obviously a lot of research had to go into the stuff to enable that to happen. So that's basically what I ended up contributing. And then I, thinking about being an academic, was obviously keen to kind of publish work based on this. So the Journal of Screenwriting published an article in 2010, and then I turned the PhD, or part of the PhD, into this book, which came out in 2011. And what I had to do with this one, of course, was the first kind of part of the dissertation, the more critical stuff, and the model was tweaked but kept pretty much as it was. But instead of having chapters about my own practice and my own screenplay, that was all taken out, of course, because who wants to read about that? And instead it was replaced with case studies of films, analysing the films based on the model. Interestingly, and I'll talk about the Journal of Screenwriting in a few slides' time, but I had quite a battle getting that published because it was really, really about practice, and this is a practice approach to understanding whatever. They kind of took issue with it quite a lot, actually. Maybe because it was badly written, I don't know. But it was like they didn't quite get the approach, and they weren't quite sure what I was saying and whether it's more like a how-to guide, even though it was from a PhD. And I'll talk about the Screenwriting Research Network as well later. But how these kind of discourses around practice were kind of almost pushed out. But I fought to have it in there, and I had to write it in a pretty dry way, but it's in there anyway. But in the book, I could be much more open and say, well, look, I'm going to have case studies I'm not going to talk about experimental filmmakers or whatever, or academic stuff. I'm going to talk about big films. So one of the film analyses is Forgetting Sarah Marshall. It's like, I was basically arguing, why can't this stuff be given academic light? So this is what I did. And I was a bit cheeky, and I asked Christopher Vogler, I'd met him before, I said, look, I've done this whole PhD, it kind of moves your model on a bit. Careful not to say anything too, like, well, yours didn't work, whatever. But would you mind having a look at it, and would you possibly be interested in writing a blurb for the back? And luckily he said yes. He could have been really pissed off and like, this is my model, but no, he wasn't. And what he said to me was that he'd been waiting for like 12, 15 years for someone to actually do something with the model and take it further. So that was really good. It also helps to sell the book because he's very big in the screenwriting world, but, whatever. And then thinking about the creative practice works as well, subsequent things I've been involved in, my own film works, script editing other people's film works, and working as a consultant on projects, it's all been inspired by this kind of stuff. Because what this PhD really brought out for me was this idea about, theme, and the importance of theme and thematic journeys and characters who undergo various obstacles because they need some kind of emotional growth. And that's what kind of underpins a lot of my work now. So that's been really good. obviously for the academic stuff, but also for the kind of practice stuff. And even just delivering workshops to festivals or whatever on this stuff, I obviously have to write about it differently, talk about it differently, but they're really interested in how it's kind of playing out. And also, as I'll talk about, screenwriting practice studies, and kind of this work and the PhD in this book and other things started to pave the way for that kind of discourse. So within, say, screenwriting studies, there's like, well, what about the practice approach? And, you know, does it sit there or does it sit somewhere else? Or how can we start to push that idea forward? And I'll talk about that. So, situating and contributing, which, like I said, wasn't really easy because there wasn't a real obvious discipline. There was like a bit of this, a bit of this, and a bit of this in order to create this. And this didn't really exist apart from in my own work. So it was a bit like, well, is it going to take off? Are people interested? Is it a really dodgy approach? It actually propelled me to spearhead screenwriting practice research in the academy and really push for this kind of, you know, practice-based approaches to screenwriting research. So in 2009, which is actually when I just submitted the PhD, Screenwriting Research Network began, based in the UK, but it's now like an international kind of a very big network of researchers. And in 2010, the Journal of Screenwriting emerged from the network. So this is all people who were really passionate about screenwriting and screenplays. They wanted to publish work about the screenplay, which is all very exciting. However, my view then and still now is that actually a lot of this stuff is really about screen studies. So screenwriting studies, the word studies is quite telling of what the thing is. So even though screenwriting is it's an activity, it's a thing you do, most of the stuff that is published in this area is actually a subset of, say, film or TV studies. And it's looking at the screenplay as text, and there's little focus on screenwriting practice, which for me was a bit of a problem, obviously because it's my area, but also because people were kind of really interested in the screenwriters who were working in the academy, but then thinking, but this is not really what I'm doing. So as I went through and started to kind of develop new ideas, new projects, there was a continuing need to borrow from creative writing with its abundance of literature on creative practice research. So when I was writing about screenwriting issues or practice issues, it was always situated around creative writing research because there's so much written about that. And obviously screenwriting is a form of creative writing, although some argue it isn't, but that's another thing. So I started to kind of publish works, critical works, based on the experiences of doing the PhD. And in these works, I try to argue that it's obviously screenwriting is a legitimate form of research. Also, how screenwriting as a practice might influence other areas, how screenwriting can help you to understand screen studies in different ways. So I was starting to kind of try and publish works that would help to develop this discourse so that other people who might be doing screenwriting PhDs down the line will be able to look at this stuff and kind of get a sense of the methodologies available. So these are some of the things that I just published a few years after the PhD. Yeah, it's been really hard to make this stick. Most practitioners are not researchers. In screenwriting practitioners are not researchers in universities. Most screenwriting researchers are not or no longer practitioners. And that's interesting because those who are no longer practitioners almost deny the practice sense because they don't want to be reminded of what they used to do. It's like they've moved on and there's something else now, rather than trying to pull them together. And in the UK, like I say, compared to here, most universities are still very naive around this stuff, not really understanding methodologies, not really understanding how it works, don't really get a sense of what a screenwriting or creative writing PhD would look like. And then 2011-12, a big thing happened. I moved to Australia. I got a job at RMIT, which is why I'm here now. And that was really good for me because I knew that obviously from the research I'd done and reading a lot of literature, most of the stuff around creative practice research was from Australia. So I knew that in some way I'd kind of be able to thrive here more than there. Much more developed understandings of creative practice research, especially at RMIT, obviously. In creative writing and screen production, much of the literature is from Australia, as I say. So it really gave me the confidence to embrace the methodology, embrace the approach, and just tell the world, hence this stuff. So I've become involved in a lot of projects, networks, collaborations, where we've really been able to talk about writing, screenwriting as a methodology, as research. So these are some of the things I've been involved in the last couple of years, where we're starting to publish stuff around screenwriting as research. So really trying to contribute to this new emerging discipline by saying, well, if it doesn't really exist, let's make it exist. Let's give it life. And you'll see that in some of these citations, actually, some of the ones I've co-written with PhD students, which has been really great. Because obviously we're working on ideas, we're working on projects, so we're saying, well, let's use some of this data to collaborate and write together. And so these guys who are starting to really understand screenwriting as a methodology in its own right are now helping to shape the discipline itself by publishing works. So the third one down, for example, that was a group of PhD students and myself. We presented at a conference last year and we published the referee proceedings. The one below, Macaulay, he's a UK-based PhD student I supervise, but he lives in Japan. So figure that one out. And it's just really great to publish with them, I think, and just kind of start to push the discourse. And we're now seeing people who are applying for PhDs or inquiring about them, kind of having seen all this stuff and saying, well, it seems that RMIT is the one to go to for this stuff, which is really good. So this idea of screenwriting practice studies, and that's obviously in inverted commas for a variety of reasons, is really starting to kind of take off. So traction has built and the discourse is really developing. So by having to situate ourselves or myself in different disciplines before and try and find a way through them, we're actually now saying, well, actually, the next generation of screenwriting practice researchers might not need to do that because this is the discourse. This is the screenwriting research. And here's how it's contributing. So it's kind of a discrete area of research that's found its feet between creative writing and screen production. And there are still lots of debates around whether screenwriting should sit in creative writing or whether it should sit in screen production. You talk to the creative writing people and they think it's fantastic because no one's writing about screenwriting, and they really see the value in looking at the screenplay itself and just thinking about the practice and the process. Not really interested in the film, they want to know about the practice and the process. Talk to screen production people and they're like, well, if the film doesn't exist, then we're not interested. I mean, that's a generalization. There are some people who are interested. So it's it still sits between the two, but you know, we're trying to say, well, okay, that's a good thing because it can have different permutations, but here's what it is. 2014, I decided to edit a book, just like, you know, you wake up in the morning and decide to edit a book, about practice-based approaches to screenwriting. And one of the reasons that I was interested in doing this was because I'd been to one of the Screenwriting Research Network conferences in 2011, I think it was, which was in Brussels, which is obviously quite meaningful today. And I came away feeling really dissatisfied, but I couldn't work out why. And I kind of realized that over the few days that a lot of people have been talking about stuff that were really interesting, but not about practice. And I thought, why aren't people talking about practice? Screenwriting is a practice. Why aren't people talking about this stuff? So I thought, right, I need to do something about it, and create a book. So I spoke to the publisher who I'd worked with before. She was really keen to do this. The Screenwriting Research Network had set up a series called the Screenwriting Studies book series within the Palgrave publishing house. So it seemed obvious that you would publish the book through that series. So I got calls for contributions, got lots of people from different countries to contribute. Here's a proposal. They hated it. They really, really hated it. They thought it was too diverse because the whole point of it was to show how screenwriting can be put into different contexts as research. And they hated it. They said, well, it should be something like, Marxist approaches to screenwriting. So every chapter should be about a Marxist approach. And I was like, that's not, no. So the publisher understood my worries, and so we decided to take it out of the series and try and publish it in its own right, just out of the series, and it was fine. we actually got different reviewers, and we found peer reviewers who would be really interested in creative writing approaches and really practice-based approaches, and they thought it was fantastic. So that got up. And in the introduction, I actually wrote a bit about that kind of process and how I think there are some limitations with the screenwriting studies stuff. They try and say this, but it's not this, etc. And so, and these are some more recent works. Again, one of them with, well, two of them with a PhD student, Stacey Taylor, who might be talking to you in a couple of weeks. Just really publishing around screenwriting studies, screenwriting practice. The second one, as you can see, this 2016 article, that really takes on this idea of screenwriting practice as a particular discipline, where it's situated, where it's not situated, and how we should be embracing it. And I actually draw on that discussion, I actually draw on some of the stuff we do in Australia around ERA, which is the research evaluation stuff, and how we can think about practice in that way. So this is all good and well. This is all kind of writing about screenwriting practice and trying to, contribute there. But of course, what about the practice itself? Well, we're starting to now build recognition of screenplays as knowledge objects or as artifacts in their own right, whether or not they're made as films. And of course, if you make a film, then the screenplay becomes a different thing, because the film is a different thing. It's been made by 100 odd people. It's moved on. So the screenplay becomes something else. So one of the journals that, again, comes out of creative writing, of course, they've actually developed this special issue series where they publish creative works as research artifacts. And they're all supported by a research statement, as we would have to write as members of staff for the ERA process. And the research statement has to talk about the research background, the research contribution, and the research significance. So really articulating creative works as research. So I've been involved in co-editing one special issue and been in two other special issues. So I've actually written screenplays directly as research artifacts, if you like. So new creative works that are published as screenplays, and the film doesn't exist, or the TV show doesn't exist, because that's not the point. The point is to show that this creative work is performing knowledge in some way. And that's been really enjoyable. You kind of move on from writing a journal article to writing a comedy script. It's good. And in this special issue series, in the second one, a couple of the candidates also put works in that were accepted as well. So even the candidates are starting to tap into this space. So just been thinking a little bit about the candidates who I'm working with at the minute, or some of them. There's been a real appetite to develop screenplays within research degrees. The first doctorate from Australia was 2003 in screenwriting. That was from QUT. There's not been very many doctorates in screenwriting since then. There's been a lot of masters by research, but not as many doctorates. But now they're starting to kind of ramp up. I'm not just saying this, but we are leading the way. Actually, we've got most of the screenwriting PhD students are here at RMIT, along with QUT and UTS, very similar types of institution, competitors you could say, but very similar approaches. And so by situating themselves, notice how they use the words here, situating themselves within the academy, candidates have got a real wish to contribute to a variety of debates and domains. So some of them are really interested in industry practices and how research and practice can connect. Some are interested in the creative process. Some are interested in social issues and how the screenplay can be used to kind of demonstrate or attack those issues. Some are interested in more theoretical ideas and how they play out in the screenplay. And some are just more interested in just, critical communities. And they're all underpinned by this notion of writing a screenplay. So the act of writing a screenplay and or the screenplay work generated from the methodology contributes to these areas. So it may be that more broadly, the contribution is screenwriting practice studies, but more specifically, each of the projects is contributing to a different thing, whether it's an industry thing or a process-based thing or a social issue or whatever. And what we found is, over the last couple of years, is that script development, which is a really industry term, how a script moves through rewrites, drafting in order to be potentially produced, and how the writer works within that with various personnel. The script development has actually become a really useful lens through which to analyze screenwriting practice as research, because it really sits between creative writing and screen production. I mean, there's a whole theory around script development, but the idea of it's a process-based, it's a writer working on a thing, but in the context of a larger thing, which is usually the industry or some kind of infrastructure. And just the idea of developing a script as research has become a really useful lens. And like I say, it can contribute to lots of different domains depending on the focus, depending on the aspiration. Some people have different aspirations for the work. Some people are writing a screenplay for a PhD and they want it to go to Hollywood. Well, at least one of them. Some of them just want to do it because they want to get into academia but still keep that practice going as well. But also fundamentally, the contribution also relies on the write-up of the work. I think the way you write up the work, the dissertation, you can do it in so many different ways, and each different way you do it will have a different contribution. Looking at my candidates now, they've probably all got 3 different ways they could write it up, and they would all kind of have a slightly different contribution. The content's still the same, but it's a slightly different question or a slightly different angle. But that's actually good because it means that you might take one way and then the others you can write about in publications and further work. So I'll just give you some examples. So candidate 1, I'm not going to name them, not that it matters, but he or she is looking at gender comedy in industry. And so for her or him, script development is a space in which to test out these ideas. Candidate 2 is really interested in alternative forms of screenwriting, digital writing, the creative process, and their position as a writer-director, which is again different to just a writer. So they're really interested in script development as a process through which experimentation can occur. Candidate 3 is really interested in looking at prose-based approaches to the screenplay and story development. So like he is creating a hybrid work between a novel and a screenplay, called a screen novel, and how the screen novel can be both an artifact in its own right, but also a tool for script development. Candidate 4 is looking at fandom, Doctor Who, and identity formation, which is quite fun. I don't watch Doctor Who, but it's quite fun to read. And they're looking at script development as a way of really fusing together theoretical ideas with practice. So there's a lot of theory around identity and fandom. There's a huge domain of that stuff. And that's kind of playing out through a screenplay methodology where the content, the characters, the thematic arcs, everything within the screenplay is reflective of those debates. And then the 5th candidate is looking at screenplay text, format and layout, and also ideas of affect. How can you achieve affect through the kind of materiality of the script, the words, the layout, the look of them on the page. And so script development for her or him is a mode of creative and critical experimentation. There's no actual going to be final screenplay. It's a series of experiments. So they're all quite different, but all really embracing screenwriting as a legitimate and innovative methodology. So just to conclude, and you can ask questions later if you like. So when I started my PhD, it started with practice, but not fully. To be honest about that. I kind of failed to recognize, for various reasons, practice has been central to the overall methodology. I kind of thought it was just going to be part of it, maybe tagged on and, whatever. And I think, well, obviously I was naive at the time, but I think a lot of it was to do with that kind of not as developed discourse in the UK as there was here. And I think a lot of that, and luckily I moved supervisors, which gave me that fresh approach, but it definitely didn't start like that. Once this kind of practice approach was better understood, I had to, as I said, situate the work through borrowing from several different disciplines because there wasn't a discipline for screenwriting practice. So I had to kind of borrow, which again is a good thing. You kind of get some innovative ideas by bringing together different disciplines, but it was a very particular, I've got to look at this, and try and match them together. So this kind of struggle, in inverted commas, led to further work, as I've explained, that really sought to define and defend screenwriting as a legitimate mode of research. And so now we're talking about a new domain that's been worked through. screenwriting practice studies or screenwriting as a research practice. So this has become a lot of the focus of my own research career, moving on. So, the irony is that all that kind of started. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't really. But now, if I went back and did it again, I would just do it totally different. But, I guess we could all say that. I think the contributions that we're making now through this work have got a much stronger methodological basis from which to draw. And I think we're now seeing people, not just here but elsewhere, who are actually drawing on the stuff we're publishing about screenwriting practice research to give them a way of situating their work. So rather than struggling to find X, Y, and Z, they're saying, well, I'm doing screenwriting as research. There's already this body of literature about it. That's my situation, my community of practice. And importantly, the RMIT candidates are really contributing to, and in fact leading these debates, helping others internationally to situate their creative practice research endeavours. I know of a lot of candidates around the world who are working in this area, and you look at the work and they're quoting this kind of stuff, which is really good. So I think, from my perspective as a supervisor, I'm really happy that the candidates are kind of wanting to contribute to the discourse by publishing about their work and telling other people about it so that they can learn and just get to grips with that methodology. All right, that's my final sentence.